You're nothing but a guest in this family now, Matt. Dad built this business for me, not you. My younger brother's voice cut through the dining hall like a blade, his words echoing off the polished wood panels as cousins, aunts, and old family friends froze mid-bite. Folks hanging in midair, their eyes darting between us as though watching a scene they had secretly waited years to witness. And I felt my face burn with a humiliation I hadn't tasted since I was a teenager standing on that very porch, being mocked by him for failing to throw a perfect spiral. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I clenched my jaw not because I wanted to lash back, I could have destroyed him with words in that instant, but because I felt the sting of something far heavier than insult. The betrayal of blood, the rewriting of legacy, the sound of my father's name being used as a weapon against me. My name is Matthew Carson. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And if you know anything about towns like mine, you know they don't measure a man by his net worth or degrees, but by the soil under his nails, the debts he honors, and the kind of weight he's willing to carry for others. I had carried plenty more than most working 18-hour days after college to turn my father's modest seed supply store into a multi-million-dollar agricultural distribution business that kept half the county's farmers afloat. My brother, Brian, younger by 4 years, was the golden boy who never clocked a day past 3 p.m., who found ways to disappear when work got heavy, but reappear when cameras or relatives came around, flashing his easy smile and telling stories about how we built this empire, though he never invested more than excuses. What most of the people in that room didn't know, what even Brian didn't realize, was that I had something tucked away, a piece of leverage buried deep in the records of our business. Something so small it was easy to overlook, but something I had been quietly protecting for years, because somewhere in the back of my mind I always feared this day would come. They thought tonight was my funeral, but they didn't know they were already stepping into the coffin themselves. The humiliation burned hotter because of the setting. It was our mother's birthday dinner, the first one since Dad had passed away, and everyone had assumed it would be a night of remembering him, telling old stories, maybe even a few tears softened by wine and laughter. Instead, Brian had chosen that night, with our mother sitting at the head of the long oak table looking frailer than I'd ever seen her, to announce that Dad's will had been finalized, the transfer of assets completed, and that the Carson Agricultural Company, the name I had poured my blood and youth into, was no longer mine to touch. He even slid a manila envelope across the table toward me as if he were gifting me something instead of gutting me, and I remember the envelope's flap brushing against the heirloom silver centerpiece, the one shaped like a cornucopia that had belonged to our grandmother, and thinking how ironic it was that a vessel symbolizing abundance was witnessing the stripping of everything I had built. Brian smiled when I didn't immediately open it, leaning back in his chair with that smug tilt of the head, the same one he used as a kid when he beat me at checkers after cheating by sliding pieces when I looked away. My mother coughed softly, as though she wanted to speak but lacked the air, and for a fleeting moment I saw her eyes dart toward me with an apology, or maybe guilt, but she said nothing, and that silence was louder than Brian's gloating. Around the table, relatives whispered, a cousin shook his head, an uncle raised his eyebrows as though to say, "I told you so." And in that chorus of judgment I realized how easily a lifetime of loyalty could be erased by ink on paper. I forced myself to pick up the envelope, sliding the documents out carefully, scanning the legal jargon that confirmed what Brian had already announced. The controlling shares of the company, the property titles, even the lake house Dad and I had renovated one summer with our bare hands all signed over to Brian. My name was absent, struck out like it never existed, and though I didn't let my face change, inside me something cracked like ice under pressure. That's when my eyes landed on a small section near the bottom. A notarized statement referencing a ledger, an old leather-bound book we had kept since the early days when every penny was handwritten because we couldn't afford software yet. Most people in that room wouldn't have thought twice about that detail, but I knew what it meant, and the memory of that ledger came rushing back. Dad teaching me how every signature mattered, how every deal we closed needed a mark of honesty, and how he had carved a tiny check mark at the bottom corner of every page he personally reviewed, a habit he passed down to me but not to Brian. That ledger, locked in a fireproof safe in my office, contained years of proof about who had really run the business, who had signed the checks, who had negotiated the contracts, and who had covered the debts when storms wiped out harvests. That book wasn't just a record, it was a witness, silent but undeniable, and I suddenly realized it might be the very key Brian had overlooked in his greed. As I slid the papers back into the envelope and placed it calmly on the table, I caught Brian's eye and gave the smallest smile, one he probably misread as defeat, but in my chest I felt a cold clarity settle. He had humiliated me tonight, stripped me in front of family, but he had also revealed his hand too soon. He thought the game was over, but the truth was, it was just beginning. The days that followed that dinner felt like walking through fog with knives hidden in the mist, every step revealing another cut I hadn't expected. And though I showed up to the office each morning in Cedar Falls like nothing had changed, I could feel the shift in the way people greeted me, the hesitation in their eyes, the half-second pause before they said, "Good morning, Matt," as though they were testing whether I still belonged there or whether I was now just a guest, like my brother had declared. And the cruelest part was how quickly loyalty evaporated when power tilted in a new direction. Brian made sure to tighten that grip fast, showing up in tailored suits he'd never worn before, parading through the office with a confidence he hadn't earned shaking hands with employees he never knew by name, introducing himself as the new head of the Carson legacy, while I sat in my office with the blinds half drawn, forcing myself to swallow the bile of watching everything I had nurtured being rewritten like some bad fairy tale where the wrong prince takes the throne. He started making changes, almost instantly outsourcing logistics to a cheaper company in Des Moines, cutting ties with suppliers Dad and I had worked with for decades, bringing in a shiny consultant from Chicago to modernize our structure, and every time I heard the words modernize or streamline, I wanted to slam my fist through the drywall because I knew what it really meant. Discard loyalty, erase history, maximize short-term profit, and bleed the soil dry. Outwardly, I let him believe I was broken, sitting quietly in meetings, nodding when he boasted about our new direction. But inside I was watching, cataloging, noting every careless word and reckless move, because if there's one thing Brian never understood, it was that impatience leaves footprints and arrogance leaves receipts. The first small win I thought I had came about 2 weeks later when an old client, Mr. Dalton, a farmer who'd been with us since I was 17, and first learning the ropes, called me directly instead of going through the new office chain. He said, "Matt, I don't like this Brian kid telling me I can't get my usual credit line till after harvest. Your daddy never would have done me like that, and I'm about to walk away if someone doesn't straighten this out." My heart surged with a flicker of hope, a reminder that relationships couldn't be stolen with a signature, that roots ran deeper than paper, and I promised him I'd find a way. I even drove out to his farm that night, the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled up to his porch where he sat in his rocking chair, his weathered face lit by the porch light, and for an hour we talked about corn yields, about Dad, about the old days, and I felt alive again, like maybe I wasn't as powerless as Brian wanted me to think. But that brief surge collapsed the next morning when Brian stormed into my office waving an email, shouting, "What the hell are you doing making deals behind my back? You're out, Matt, you hear me? OUT, you have no authority anymore." His voice echoed down the hallway, and I could hear staff stop typing, heads peeking over cubicles, the humiliation public and deliberate. And though I sat still, my pulse hammering, I muttered, "I was just honoring an old promise," and he sneered, "Promises don't pay bills, brother. Get used to it." That line hit me like a slap, because Dad used to say the exact opposite, that promises were worth more than cash if a man was willing to back them with sweat. And for Brian to twist that into a weapon made me realize just how deeply he'd been waiting to tear down not just me, but everything Dad stood for. From there, he escalated the humiliation in subtle ways, stripping my name off the company letterhead, moving my office down the hall into what used to be a storage closet, temporarily suspending my expense account, and telling employees I'd taken a step back to focus on personal projects while he was steering the ship. He was clever, I'll give him that. He didn't fire me outright, no. He wanted me visible, lingering, diminished, like a ghost haunting the halls of a house I'd built, but no longer owned, so everyone could see me fade in real time. And though some days I wanted to walk away, to pack up my things and disappear, I forced myself to endure it, because the ledger still existed, the fireproof safe still stood in my office, and every day I'd unlock it, hold that leather-bound book in my hands, trace the pages with my fingers like a priest handling scripture, reminding myself that inside here was not just numbers but truth, the truth that would one day shatter Brian's glass castle. Still, the setbacks cut deeper than I expected. My mother, who I thought might speak up, remained silent, attending meetings where Brian paraded her around like an accessory, her frail hand looped through his arm as he called her the matriarch. And when I asked her privately why she let this happen, she only whispered, "Your father wanted peace, Matthew. Don't stir up more fighting," which felt like a betrayal all its own. Because peace built on lies isn't peace at all, it's surrender. I played my role though, letting the world believe I was shrinking, nodding when employees whispered, "Hang in there, Matt," pretending to sip whiskey at the bar when Brian toasted himself in front of cousins, gritting my teeth when he told anyone who would listen that Matt doesn't have the stomach for the big leagues. He's old school, sentimental, I'm the future. Each barb sank deeper, but each also hardened something inside me, shaping a resolve that turned colder by the day. And though I wanted to strike back then, to fling the ledger in his smug face and crumble, I knew it wasn't time yet. Timing is everything in both farming and war. You don't harvest before the crop is ready, and you don't strike before your enemy thinks they've won. So I smiled through my teeth. I played the broken man. I let him think I was finished. But back then, I didn't realize the one detail Brian overlooked would be the very rope he'd used to hang himself, and all I had to do was wait for him to tighten the noose. The waiting became its own kind of torture, like living inside a ticking clock where every second was a reminder of what I'd lost and what I was risking, because if Brian discovered the ledger before I was ready, the game would be over before it began, and yet that pressure also sharpened me, forced me to see patterns in his bravado and opportunities hidden in plain sight. He was so obsessed with proving himself that he started announcing bold new deals, pushing expansions into territories we had no infrastructure for, and every time he boasted at the Rotary Club or over drinks at Murphy's Tavern, I listened closely, memorizing the names, the companies, the promises, knowing eventually one of them would collapse under the weight of his lies. The trap I was setting wasn't just about exposing his incompetence, it was about letting him build such a towering illusion of power that when it fell, the crash would be heard in every corner of Cedar Falls, and nobody would be able to pretend they hadn't seen the truth all along. I spent long nights in my cramped new office, the smell of dust and stale paper heavy in the air, poring over old contracts, cross-referencing signatures, highlighting discrepancies, because the ledger wasn't just symbolic, it was proof that Dad and I had personally underwritten dozens of contracts and cleaned up dozens of messes Brian had no part in, and if used correctly, it could establish beyond question that his new reign was built on fraud and manipulation. What I needed was the right moment, the right stage, and as fate would have it, Brian himself gave me both. One morning in late October, when the air carried that crisp bite that smelled of harvested corn stalks and wood smoke, Brian strode into the office with his consultant from Chicago and announced that we'd be hosting a legacy celebration gala at the Cedar Falls Civic Center, inviting clients, employees, family, and half the damn town to witness him deliver a speech about the new era of Carson Agricultural. He even had banners printed with his face next to Dad's, as if they were co-founders rather than father and son, and I remember staring at one in the hallway, the ink still smelling sharp and chemical, and thinking, this is it. This is where he falls. Because a stage that large, with so many eyes watching, wasn't just an opportunity for him to crow it, was the perfect platform for me to pull the rug out and let him choke on his own arrogance. But I couldn't move too soon. I needed to secure every piece of evidence, to build my case so airtight that when I struck, there would be no recovery, no denial, no misunderstanding he could spin. So I played my part, nodding when he asked me to help coordinate logistics for the gala, which was his way of keeping me busy with menial work, and I smiled through my teeth as he bragged about the turnout we'd get, how people would finally see who the real Carson heir was. The deadline loomed like storm clouds, 3 weeks until the gala, and every day the tension grew thicker. Employees walked on eggshells, clients grumbled quietly about delayed shipments, and my mother busied herself with small tasks, as though pretending everything was normal would make it so. But beneath the surface, I was tightening the noose. Copies of the ledger pages were made and stored safely in multiple locations. Contracts with Dad's original signatures highlighted, records of Brian's unauthorized decisions documented, and through a quiet contact at the local bank, a man who owed me more than a few favors, I secured proof that Brian had been leveraging the company's credit line to fund his flashy new projects without proper collateral. Each piece clicked into place like teeth on a gear, and though my hands sometimes shook from the pressure, the weight of humiliation still fresh in my veins, I reminded myself of Dad's old phrase, "Harvest doesn't come to those who rush, it comes to those who endure." I endured, even when Brian scored what he thought was another victory by announcing at the weekly staff meeting that he'd officially renamed the company to Carson Global, erasing the word agricultural, as if the dirt and sweat that built it were something to be ashamed of. People clapped, some enthusiastically, others nervously, and I sat there with my arms crossed, silent. But inside I whispered, "Global won't matter when local collapses under your feet." And then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. A week before the gala, I overheard Brian late at night in the office, his voice muffled through the wall as he argued with someone on the phone, saying, "Don't worry, once the paperwork's finalized after the gala, Mom's house will be in my name too. She won't even realize it until it's done." My chest tightened, my breath caught, because the house he was talking about wasn't just real estate, it was the farmhouse where Dad had been born, where we'd spent Christmases, where Mom still sat every evening on the porch swing humming to herself. The house wasn't part of the company. It was supposed to pass to both of us equally, a symbol of the family itself. And for him to steal that too wasn't about money, it was about humiliation, about erasing me from every corner of our heritage until I was nothing but a rumor. That was when the cold clarity crystallized. This wasn't just about business, it was about blood. And he wasn't going to stop until he owned not only the company but the story of who we were. And that was when I knew the symbolic weight of the ledger would matter more than ever. Because if Dad's habit of marking every page with a check was the seal of truth, then exposing that truth in front of everyone at the gala would be the final nail in Brian's coffin. The night before the gala, I barely slept, the ticking of the old clock in my apartment sounding like a metronome for my racing thoughts. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd time it, how I'd unveil the evidence, but I also wrestled with the doubt that maybe I was sinking to his level. Maybe I should just walk away, start fresh somewhere else. But then I remembered his words at that dinner. The way he'd announced I was nothing but a guest in this family now. And I felt the heat of that humiliation again, the sting of every whisper since, and I knew walking away wasn't peace, it was surrender. The next day, as the Civic Center filled with people in suits and dresses, the air buzzing with chatter, the smell of catered roast beef and wine filling the room, I stood in the wings, the leather-bound ledger tucked under my arm like a weapon nobody else recognized yet. Brian took the stage in his tailored suit, his smile wide, his voice booming as he declared, "Tonight, we honor my father's vision and the new era of Carson Global," and the crowd applauded, some rising to their feet, and for a moment I almost admired his ability to command a room. But as he continued, weaving lies about his leadership, his sacrifices, his supposed partnership with Dad, I saw the cracks, the slight quiver in his voice when he exaggerated, the flicker of his eyes toward me in the wings, as if daring me to contradict him. He didn't know it yet, but the trap was already closed, the ledger already loaded, and in less than 10 minutes, his empire would collapse in front of every soul he had invited to witness his triumph. As Brian basked in the applause, pausing theatrically before each sentence, savoring the weight of his own words, I stepped onto the stage with the ledger tucked firmly under my arm, and though my legs trembled from the sheer electricity of the moment, my voice carried calm when I said, "Before you go any further, brother, I think the town deserves to hear the truth." And the room fell into a hush, so sudden I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the clink of a fork dropped against a plate. All eyes turning toward me, some wide with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none leading me as I walked across the stage and set the leather-bound book on the podium. Brian's face froze, his smirk faltering as though he had glimpsed a ghost, and he leaned into the mic, sneering, "Matt, this isn't your show anymore. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." I looked at him, straight into the eyes that had watched me build this empire while he lounged, and said evenly, "Embarrassment? You mean like being cut out of a company I built? Or watching you use Dad's name to claim sacrifices you never made? You see, Brian, Dad had a habit you never noticed, and it's all right here in this book." The crowd stirred, people whispering, shifting in their chairs, while I flipped open the ledger, the smell of old leather and ink filling my nose like a reminder of nights spent working beside Dad in the back office, his tired hands guiding mine as we signed checks by lamplight. I held up a page, pointing to the faint checkmark at the bottom corner, Dad's subtle stamp of authenticity, and said, "Every deal, every loan, every partnership Dad marked it himself. And when he wasn't there, he made me do it under his eye. That's why every page for 20 years carries that mark. Except, of course, the pages Brian handled, because Brian wasn't there." Gasps rippled through the audience, people craning their necks to see, and I flipped through more pages, each marked with Dad's check, each name and date a hammer pounding the truth into the coffin of Brian's lies. Brian lunged for the book, snarling, "This doesn't prove anything." But I snapped it shut and held it firmly, saying, "Maybe not a loan. But combined with the contracts signed in my name, the loans underwritten by me personally, the records of your unauthorized credit extensions, and your recent attempt to transfer Mom's house into your own name without her knowledge. Yeah, it proves plenty." A murmur swelled into outrage as heads turned toward my mother, who sat in the front row, her face pale, her hand clutching the armrest, and for the first time since Dad's death, her voice rang out strong and clear. "Brian, is this true?" He stammered, sweat glistening at his temples, his polished suit suddenly looking too tight, and before he could answer, I slid a folder across the podium. Documents spilling out bank statements, contracts, notarized forms, all the evidence I'd gathered. "These aren't my words, Brian," I said, my voice steady as steel. "They're yours, your signatures, your deals, your greed. You wanted to erase me from this family, but in doing so, you left a trail a mile wide, and now everyone gets to see it." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause, the kind that smothered a man alive, and I watched my brother shrink in real time, his shoulders curling inward, his eyes darting, the smugness draining out like blood from a wound. And yet, I wasn't done, because the poetic justice demanded more than exposure, it demanded reflection of the very humiliation he had inflicted on me. I opened the ledger again, turned to a blank page, and pulled from my pocket the same pen Dad had given me when I graduated college. The one engraved with the Carson name. The one Brian had once mocked as old-fashioned. I clicked it, the sound echoing in the silent hall, and said, "You told me promises don't pay bills, Brian. But Dad taught us the opposite, that a man's word, sealed by his mark, is worth more than gold. So tonight I'm making one last promise, in front of everyone here." And with deliberate motion, I drew Dad's checkmark on the blank page and signed beneath it, "Matthew Carson." I held it up high and said, "This mark means the Carson legacy will never belong to greed. It will never belong to lies. It belongs to truth, to hard work, to everyone who actually earned it. And from this day forward, it will never belong to you." The crowd erupted not in polite applause, but in a thunderous roar, employees on their feet, clients clapping, even old Mr. Dalton shouting, "That's the Matt I know!" As the hall shook with vindication, Brian stumbled backward, his face red, his chest heaving, and in a desperate bid he screamed, "This isn't over! You'll regret this!" Before storming offstage, but the look in people's eyes told me it was over, that his empire had crumbled the moment the truth was revealed. The double twist came afterward when the legal process unfolded in the weeks that followed. The documents I revealed didn't just humiliate Brian, they opened the door for a full investigation, one that uncovered embezzlement and fraud so extensive he faced criminal charges, and while he pleaded for leniency, claiming ignorance, the court didn't buy it. But the deeper twist, the one even I hadn't expected, came when the family lawyer revealed a clause in Dad's will, one I had overlooked in my grief, a clause that stated, "The controlling interest of Carson Agricultural shall rest with the son who demonstrates stewardship, honesty, and the preservation of our values, as proven by record." The ledger, the very symbol Brian dismissed, was the deciding factor, and by producing it, I had not only defended myself but legally secured majority ownership of the company once more. It was as if Dad had anticipated this fight, leaving behind a final safeguard, trusting that the son who carried his mark would prevail. When the lawyer read that clause aloud, I felt a weight lift I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the night of that dinner, and though victory felt cold after so much betrayal, it was still victory. In the end, poetic justice was served not only through Brian's downfall, but through my release. Because as satisfying as it was to watch him stripped of the power he craved, the greater satisfaction came from realizing I no longer needed his approval, nor the family's silence, nor even the company itself to define me. I rebuilt Carson Agricultural in Dad's image, restoring the old name, rehiring the suppliers Brian had cut, creating a scholarship fund for local farm kids who wanted to study agriculture. The soil healed, the trust returned, and the name Carson once again meant something honest. As for Brian, he disappeared from Cedar Falls, unable to show his face again, and I heard through whispers he bounced from city to city, chasing schemes that never stuck. Sometimes late at night, I still see his face from that moment on stage, the instant he realized the game was lost, and I remind myself that humiliation doesn't destroy a man, it reveals who he really is. He tried to erase me with signatures, but it was the smallest mark, Dad's quiet check in the corner of a page, that erased him instead. And so the story ended not with me reclaiming what was mine, but with me finally understanding what Dad always meant. The harvest belongs not to those who grab quickest, but to those who endure longest. I endured, and in the end, endurance was the sharpest revenge of all. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.